Welcome to a Rice University digital media production. For more information about us, please visit our website at www.rice.edu.
Glad to see all of you here. I'm Susan McIntosh, Director of Scientia, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this colloquium in our year-long series on Rice, A Century of Change. Last semester we had colloquia that looked back in time to a period when Rice became a significant research university in the wake of the Masterson Affair, the development of the Shepherd School, and we also had colloquia that considered developments in Rice social sciences and nanotechnology on a temporal axis that moved from past to future, projecting ahead from the perspective of current trends, research, and innovation. Today, we're going to have a talk that considers the future shape of the humanities at Rice as they are affected by the technologies and trends that are rapidly reconfiguring how we teach and do research. If you read the Chronicle of Higher Education with any regularity, you'll know that digital humanities is one of the hottest and most frequent topics they cover. One of their Prof Hacker bloggers has established a digital humanities questions and answers website that is enormously interesting. Now, luckily for all of us, we can get all our questions answered today by a nationally recognized innovator in the digital humanities, Lisa Spiro. Lisa Spiro is well known to most, if not all of us here, from her work as director of the Digital Media Center at Fondren Library, where she oversaw the campus's central multimedia lab, worked with instructors on integrating technology into the curriculum, and contributed to digital library projects. She led workshops on digital storytelling, digital research tools, and text markup, and many of us benefited from these projects and her vision and dedication. We were sad to see her leave Rice, but delighted that her new position as director of the labs of the National Institute for Technology in Liberal Education, or NITLE, allows her to remain physically here in Houston, or at least most of the time. In her work at NITLE, Dr. Spiro works with the liberal arts community to explore collaborative approaches to integrating learning scholarship and technology. Her research interests include the digital humanities, open education, and the transformation of libraries. As part of her passion for tracking emerging educational technologies and analyzing their implications for research and teaching, she founded the Digital Research Tools Wiki, with an acronym, DIRT, and authors the Digital Scholarship in the Humanities blog. Dr. Spiro's recent publications include essays examining alternative academic careers, advocating for digital humanities community to develop a statement of its values, and studying how scholars use digital archives in American literature and culture. That she co-wrote with Jane Siegel. A 2003 Frye Fellow, Dr. Spiro holds a BA in English and History, magna cum laude, from Rice, and a PhD in English, yes, from the University of Virginia. While at the University of Virginia, she worked on text encoding projects for the Electronic Text Center and served briefly as managing editor for Postmodern Culture, one of the first humanities journals to be published on the internet. She also serves on the board of the Digital Humanities Commons, the Executive Council for the Association of Computers and the Humanities, and the Program Committee for the Joint Conference on Digital Libraries. We are absolutely thrilled to have her here speaking on prospects for the humanities in a digitized and networked age. Lisa.
Thank you, Susan. There we go. So thank you for that very generous introduction. It's a thrill to be here and to see so many friends. And as someone who has attended many a Scientia lecture in the past, it's also a real honor to be part of this series looking at the history and future of Rice. So when Rice had its opening. The trustees held a dinner in which they invited scholars representing different communities to speak. And President Lovett ensured that the sciences follow the humanities to have a proper balance among the disciplines. The speaker representing letters, Henry Van Dyke of Princeton University, spoke to the purpose of the study of literature at a university like Rice and pointed to the need to promote the love of good literature, to ensure that students know how to read between the lines, and to help them to enter through the printed page into deeper knowledge of life. Now, if we were to make a toast to the humanities for the next 100 years of Rice's history, we might begin to complicate this idea that the purpose of the study of literature is just about promoting the love of good literature. We would probably embrace this notion that it is about facilitating critical reading and close reading. And I think we would question this idea that it's about the printed page. The way that we interact with text, with media, is being transformed as a result of the digital revolution. So in the next 100 years, we can expect that the nature of the media that the humanities engage with will be transformed. What does this mean for the future of the studies of humanities at Rice and indeed at universities around the world? When we think about the future of the humanities, many are likely to be somewhat gloomy, given all the sort of rhetoric around the crisis in the humanities. And indeed, there are indicators that there are real problems in the humanities. If we look, for example, at the public questioning of the value of liberal education, most notoriously by the governor of Florida, if we look at massive cuts in support for higher education in states like California and support for humanities in the UK, if we look at the closing of programs in foreign language and the classics, and if we look to the small number, relatively speaking, of tenure-track jobs in the humanities, less than half of English PhDs, for example, can expect to find a tenure-track job. These are all indicators of trouble in the humanities. But I would also argue that we have reason for hope, and we don't want to get caught up in despair. And one kind of small but significant indicator is if you look at collections like iTunes Use, top collections, you notice that about a third of the courses focus on arts and the humanities. So there's a real public interest in understanding philosophy, in studying photography, in learning how to speak foreign languages, alongside an interest in entrepreneurship and in understanding technology. And in a sense, the digital humanities kind of brings these enthusiasms together and gives us a way of thinking about how we can shape the future of the humanities. So counter to this discourse of decline, we see a lot of discussions of the rise of digital humanities. So just a week ago, I returned from the Modern Language Association conference, and it was hard not to notice the attention paid to the digital humanities. About 8% of the sessions dealt with digital humanities in some way. And even the literary theorist Stanley Fish noted this in a column and pointed to a new insurgency associated with the digital humanities. But if this is an insurgency, it's one that's being embraced by the leadership of organizations like the MLA and the American Historical Association. There was a high-profile panel on the future of higher education in a digital age that featured two people from the information technology and computer science community and two from the humanities community. And the former president of the MLA, Sidonie Smith, really called for transformation in the humanities, powered in part by digital technologies. So she called for scholars to embrace open digital forms of communication and conversation, to pay attention not just to small words, but also to big data, and to reconceptualize scholarly collaboration so that scholars collaborate with students, with scholars from different disciplines, and with the larger community. So you may wonder, okay, what's all the fuss? Is this just a fad? What's going on? I would suggest that it's not a fad, that the digital is increasingly defining how we interact with culture. So let me offer a brief definition of the digital humanities that comes from one of the leading journals in the field, Digital Humanities Quarterly, which emphasizes that digital humanities is diverse. So it encompasses many disciplines, many professional practices: history, literature, philosophy, librarianship, faculty, graduate students, information technology staff. It's a still emerging field, which is part of the fun. It explores the practice of humanities research, and I would add teaching and scholarly communication through information technology, and explores the continued evolution of the humanities as a result of the interactions with technology, media, and computational methods. Now, I'm well trained enough as a humanist not to argue that the digital humanities are going to swoop in and save the humanities. But I will suggest that the digital humanities can hack the humanities. And by the term hack, I don't mean that digital humanists are nefarious hackers who are trying to bring down the computer systems of the CIA or the Bank of America, but rather that many in the digital humanities take a sort of playful approach to problems. They try to build solutions. It's a sort of do-it-yourself approach that is about making and remaking and reimagining institutions and practices. One really compelling example of this is presented by the volume Hacking the Academy, which is, as you can see from the tagline, a book crowdsourced in 1 week. So Dan Cohen and Tom Scheinfeld, who are at the Center for History and New Media at George Mason University, issued a call to the community. Send us your contributions, be they blog posts, videos, whatever form of media that tackles the question whether the institutions of the academy, as they have existed for decades, even centuries, aren't becoming obsolete. And in the course of that week, they received 329 submissions from 177 different authors. Now, a lot of those submissions had already been written, but it still shows the sort of engagement in the community in tackling these sorts of questions. Now, all of the contributions had what are called Creative Commons licenses associated with them, which says that you can reuse this material as long as you attribute it. And as a result of those open licenses, a scholar in the digital humanities community named Mark Sample was able to take these contributions and produce both an ebook version that could be freely downloaded, as well as what he called an algorithmically altered version called Hacking the Accident. So he replaced all the nouns in the text with the nouns that occurred 7 nouns later in the dictionary, so that academy becomes accident, print becomes prison. This is play, but it's purposeful play, illuminating play. This volume will, by the way, appear in print from the University of Michigan Press. There's a sort of curated version that really kind of pulls out the key themes in the submissions. But the topics that this volume explores include how to transform scholarly communications by turning to open forms of peer review, something I'll talk about more later, how to engage students in sort of being co-creators of knowledge, how to rethink the academic conference, so it's not just about passively listening but actively participating. What this volume doesn't really touch on are sort of larger forces confronting higher education: rising costs, declining public budgets, a move to reimagine the way that we credential learning. But I think that's in part because these are areas that are kind of outside the bounds of what the digital humanities can typically confront. So why do we care about hacking the academy? Tad Suter, in his introduction to this volume, I think raises some key issues in talking about the ways in which the academy really can only be invigorated and improved by bringing this kind of hacker ethos beyond computer science throughout all the disciplines in order to help solve problems in a really practical, concrete way, to explore and deepen our knowledge, and to have a little fun. So in the rest of my talk, I'd like to point to some ways that the digital humanities community is establishing models that we might consider for ways that we can begin to transform some of our outmoded institutions. Let me start by talking about the need to engage with the digital age. If you think about the ways in which society has changed since the emergence of the web 20 years ago, we would point to, for example, the rise of social networking, the ability to connect to friends and colleagues. We might point to the rise of platforms that allow us to create and share knowledge and media, like WordPress for blogging, or YouTube for video, or Flickr for images. We might point to the ability to basically pull out our smartphones and have an answer to a question at our fingertips, should we choose to look it up. And we might point also to the ability to search across these vast stores of information to acquire, again, knowledge and answers to our questions. So I wonder, and this is a participatory part of the talk, how many of you turn to a search engine like Google when you begin a research project? Okay, a fair number of people in the crowd. Now, how many of you feel overwhelmed by the volume of information that's available? Actually, I'm surprised to not see more hands up. But I think these are two of the issues that the digital humanities is tackling: access to information and how we begin to sort through and make sense of that information. One of the most articulate people who's talking about the need for the humanities to engage with the digital age is Kathy Davidson, who is the former provost of interdisciplinary initiatives at Duke. And she, by the way, will be speaking at the DeLange conference next month, and I encourage you to attend. And she talks about the ways in which the humanities need to really acknowledge the power that computation and networks bring to not only the sciences, but also to the humanities, and the potential, again, for transformation, and the responsibility for the humanities community to engage with these transformative powers. And let me point to a couple of ways that I think the digital humanities community is beginning to do this. One is in making available cultural and scholarly information. So beginning in the 1990s, many in the digital humanities community began to build authoritative digital collections, and along the way develop standards and processes for making this information available, as well as bringing attention to kind of theories of archiving and thinking about what it means to create a digital archive. And also developing standards to ensure the robustness and long-term availability of the data. In addition, the community has been working on ways of engaging the larger community in helping to, for example, transcribe the manuscripts of Jeremy Bentham, or to develop interfaces that allow for exploration of massive amounts of data. One example of the impact of these digital archives comes from the Walt Whitman project. So I was curious about the impact that these digital archives were having on the study of American literature and culture, and teamed up with my colleague Jane Siegel to really probe this question. And one of the archives that we looked at was the Walt Whitman archive, which started up in the mid-1990s and collects manuscript materials and published versions of every edition of Leaves of Grass, and a number of other materials. In talking to the Whitman scholars, I was struck by the ways in which they describe this as an indispensable resource, the first place they turn to study the works of Walt Whitman. And it has had profound effects on the scholarship. For example, because of access to the manuscripts of Whitman, because of access to all the different editions of Leaves of Grass, there's been renewed attention to manuscript study, to the study of text, and the significance of these different editions. There's also been more attention to the context surrounding the works of Whitman. For example, paying attention to the works of Whitman's disciples who shed light on Whitman's life and practice. Perhaps most profoundly, though, projects like the Walt Whitman Archive expand access to humanities information. So, for example, the Whitman Archive in one fairly typical month got 30,000 hits from 143 different countries. Another indication of the sort of public hunger for access to humanistic knowledge. Now, along with these, the potential of having access to so much information, we have challenges in dealing with that massive amount of information. How do we handle this problem of abundance? And this is a question that the NEH tackled in collaboration with other grant agencies in the United States and the UK through its Digging into Data challenge, which posed the question, now that we have access to so much information, what do we do? How do we develop computationally based methods to make sense of this data? So this grant program required collaborative international teams to take on the challenge. 8 out of about 90 won grants in this first round. And the projects covered topics like the history of railroads in America, speech, images, letters. One project that I want to focus on is called With Criminal Intent. And this is based upon the Old Bailey archive, which contains transcripts of nearly 200,000 trials held at the Old Bailey, which is London's central criminal court between the late 17th and early 20th century. So this is a massive database of 127 million words. And the project essentially integrates 2 of my favorite tools that I would recommend that you explore. They're freely available. Zotero, which allows scholars to organize and collect information, and Voyant, which provides a way of visualizing textual information. And they provided a way of sort of filtering and understanding the massive amounts of data made available through the Old Bailey archive. So, for example, you could pose a query about how religious offenses were handled in London, and further filter that by the gender of the defendant, for example, or the punishment that was assigned, as well as by date and other factors. You can then pull the results of your initial search into Voyant, this text visualization environment, which allows you to begin to make some initial observations about the nature of this information. So, for example, you might observe that popish and priest occur a lot in this corpus of data. You might also look at these sort of larger patterns across the collection, the sort of frequency with which terms are used. You can also identify unique terms. So this is a tool that helps you to discover patterns in this large amount of data, and then begin to drill down and ask questions about those patterns. You can look at words as they appear in context. You can look at sort of the most frequently used words across the entire corpus, and you can actually begin to look at the text itself as you probe the significance of these patterns. Now, all this talk about humanities data may be setting off alarm bells. This may seem too empirical in its approach. It may seem to be too sciencey even. But I agree with my friend Steve Ramsey in his comments on this project and the larger purposes of the digital humanities when he talks about why we mine text, and points to the fact that although we may be looking at the length of trials, we may be looking at the numbers of instances of poisoning, what we're really trying trying to get at is the significance of these stories and what they tell us about the human condition. This is fundamentally what the humanities are about. And already this project has led to some insights. For example, scholars using these tools have observed that around 1825, the number of guilty pleas rose, and there was also a higher instance of shorter trial transcripts, which led them to begin to think that there was a rise in plea bargaining at this period. So one of the kind of core purposes of this project is also to make available tools as well as data to the ordinary working historian as a way of making available sort of new research methods to the larger community. Another thing that you can do with data and tools is begin to see the dynamics of change. So a compelling project here was developed by Ed Ayers, who's now the president of the University of Richmond, to begin to understand migration patterns in the African American community between 1810 and 1970. And he talks about these sorts of visualizations of space and time as being like historical weather maps that allow you to see these larger forces at work. So this map shows you migration patterns, and the white dots represent, of course, the density of population among the African American community. So we can see migration along this timeline spread across the map. And this red bar, of course, represents the Civil War. So you begin to see the development of population centers in Detroit and Chicago, migration west. In a 30-second visualization, you can begin to, I think, build some real insights into the nature of these kind of demographic changes. So as I talk about these different digital humanities projects, I want to really point to some great work that's being done at Rice. Rice is certainly a participant in the activity in the digital humanities community. And this includes the creation of digital archives, some of which I've been involved with, like the Travelers in the Middle East Archive and the Our Americas Archive Partnership. This also includes scholars who are doing work that I consider to be sort of hacking the humanities. We were lucky enough to have Lena Dibb, who's an anthropology graduate student working at the Digital Media Center. And she both develops interactive exhibits that explore the nature of memory and our experiences of sound, for example. And she also does research exploring the significance of modern recording devices for our conceptions of memory. I would also point to the work of Don Johnson on art forensics, exploring ways that we can use computer algorithms to detect patterns in canvases and then use those to help us date works of art by artists like Van Gogh. Of course, the digital humanities community has been talking a lot about avoiding the rhetoric of utopianism and acknowledging that there are real challenges. And challenges to doing digital work include, of course, developing skills, the technical skills that are required to do this work, getting access to data, which is particularly a problem when you're dealing with 20th century data and have to confront the copyright challenges. Also understanding the data and its limitations. What's not included in the digital archive? What am I missing in searching for information in a particular way? Finding the right tool to work with data, and again, understanding its limitations. And finally, devising appropriate methodological approaches. So some in the digital humanities community are exploring probability and statistics as part of understanding humanistic data. And most of us don't really have training in this domain. So it's important, I think, to collaborate as we develop these new approaches. So when we look to colleagues in science and engineering, of course, collaboration is a core part of how these disciplines work. The NSF's science and engineering indicators showed that the median number of authors across science and engineering is 4.7. The humanities indicators do not include a category for co-authorship because, frankly, it's so rare. I did a small study looking at co-authorship in the humanities and the digital humanities, comparing a journal, American Literary History in sort of the traditional humanities with literary and linguistic computing in the digital humanities, and found that while about 2% of the articles in the Literary Studies Journal were collaborative, they were co-authored, about 48% of the articles in the digital humanities journals had co-authors. And I think this speaks in part to the interdisciplinary nature of this journal. It includes publications by computer scientists, literary scholars, historians, librarian and information scientists, and so forth. There's also a fairly high degree of global or international authorship. So in literary and linguistic computing, about 16% of the collaboratively written articles included people from 2 or more countries. So there are many forms of collaboration in the digital humanities. I'm going to focus on just 3: the building of digital collections and resources, interdisciplinary research methods, and participatory humanities. And this comes from a publication that was just released on computing and communicating knowledge in the digital humanities. So looking at the creation of these digital archives that I spoke about earlier, collaboration is at the core. You need people who understand this kind of subject domain. You need programmers. You need librarians who understand how to describe the information. You need people to design the interfaces. You need students to do a lot of the grunt work, but who also get the opportunity to learn these key skills. So the Orlando project, for example, involved about 100 people to construct this resource that focuses on the history of women's writing. And as you can see from the tagline, collaboration is at its core. It's an ongoing collaborative experiment in the use of computers to engage in women's literary history. As part of the process of developing this resource, a smaller subset of that group of 100 had to devise methods for encoding the data. So for example, saying that this work by this particular author was collaboratively written. Collaboration was part of what the project is interested in tracking. This data can be made available to the readers as part of an effort to sort of expose these knowledge structures. Another example of collaborative approaches in the digital humanities is in devising new research methods. So Brad Pesanek, who was at the time a graduate student in literature at Stanford, was working on a study of metaphor in 18th century literature. And he had compiled this database of examples of metaphor by hand, thousands of examples. At a wedding, he ran into an old friend who happened to be a computer scientist. And this friend, Dee Scully, said, "You're insane to do this by hand. There's got to be a better way. Get beyond the drudgery of doing this work by hand." So Scully and Pesanek collaborated to try to develop methods for automatically detecting metaphor using this database that Pesanek had compiled as sort of the basic training data. Along the way, I think that they realized some important things about the nature of interdisciplinary collaboration. So they talk about the ways in which defamiliarization was an important part of the process, where a literary scholar had to look at this data about probability measures and how those correlated with the styles associated with different authors. And this forced him to look at literature in a new way. It brought his attention to these works in a new way. And there's also a sort of rich interdisciplinary dialogue about the terms that scholars in different disciplines use and how we sort of establish trustworthy, authoritative knowledge. One of their conclusions is, of course, about the difficulty of using these computational approaches when there is a degree of interpretation in determining, for example, what a metaphor is, how you're going to represent your data. But I think this experiment demonstrates the ways in which collaboration between different disciplines can open up new dialogues and new approaches to knowledge. My final example is the participatory humanities. So we have this idea of the public humanities kind of reaching out to the community. But Kathy Davidson and David Theo Goldberg talk about the need to reach in as well and to recognize the knowledge that communities can bring to the conversation. So Hypercities is a geotemporal platform that allows you to look at both place and time. Scholars and members of the community can use this interface that's based on Google Maps, but kind of goes beyond that, to add markers to maps and also place those markers according to a timeline to sort of create their own geotemporal narratives, their own narratives of experience in space and time. And you can embed video and images and audio in these markers as a way of telling this story. So this project has included contributions by historians, by members of the community, such as youth who are associated with a Filipino organization in Los Angeles. It has mapped the protests in Iran in 2009. The developer of this project, Todd Pressner, talks about it as being sort of like a city in its diversity. You have these different layers representing different kinds of experiences that are located in place and time. It's a form of time mapping. Again, I wanted to highlight some important work in collaboration in the humanities here at Rice, whether that be in creating digital archive projects, in the work at the Humanities Research Center on emerging disciplines and cultures of energy, in projects like the HERE project, which really engage the community. So there's a lot of activity already in collaborative approaches to the humanities at Rice. Here again, I want to also acknowledge that there are challenges to collaborating. One challenge that particularly faces humanities disciplines that are not really used to collaborative work is figuring out how to evaluate this work and assign credit. Now, organizations like the Modern Language Association are taking on this challenge and trying to develop standards, but it's something that institutionally we have to acknowledge. Another issue, of course, is managing collaborations and clearly defining goals and expectations, having clear communication processes, and thinking about ways of resolving conflict. When you're talking about participatory projects, there is a need to sort of balance openness and authority. So you want, trustworthy knowledge, but at the same time, you want to recognize the ideas that the community can bring to the discussion of how we understand knowledge. And finally, it can be difficult for some to find publication venues for interdisciplinary work. When I talked to Brad Pasanek, he said, the literature journals thought our work was too computer science-y, the computer science journals thought our work was too much in the literary studies domain, so they found a home for their work in literary and linguistic computing, which kind of marries the two. Which leads me to my next point about the need to transform scholarly communication. So this is another participatory part of the talk. What would you say are the average sales of humanities monographs to libraries? And the librarians in the crowd may know the answer to this question. Ballpark figure.
What's the question?
The number of sales of humanities monographs to libraries. 200, you got it. That's a typical number. And you might expect another 200 copies of a humanities monograph to be sold. But
relatives.
Pardon?
Relatives.
Right, to relatives. Yeah, who knows? But the sales are typically quite low. percentage of humanities articles, sorry, I almost gave away the answer, that are uncited 5 years after publication. 80%, yeah. And the typical time to publish an academic book in the humanities? Yeah, from when it's submitted. 2.5 years. Yeah, I couldn't find data on this, but I think 2.5 years is about right. 2 to 3 years. So I recently participated in a collection on debates in the digital humanities, and the request for proposals came out in January of last year. The volume came out just a few weeks ago, and this was acknowledged by all who participated to be warp speed. More typical is a publication I did with Jane Siegel, where we did the research in 2007, and the book appeared as part of a sort of collection on digital humanities in American studies at the tail end of 2010, at which point some of our findings didn't seem quite so relevant. So this points to issues in terms of the currency of humanities research. It points to issues with audience, and it also, I think, points to economic issues. So it's really difficult for a lot of junior faculty in particular to have their first book published, because libraries who are stretched by the rising cost of serial subscriptions don't have the budget to buy a lot of humanities monographs anymore, and because presses typically receive less support from their universities. Presses thus have to focus more on what's marketable, what they can sell to a larger audience, which makes it very difficult for first books to be published. And this is a problem that Kathleen Fitzpatrick tackles in her book Planned Obsolescence, which focuses on ways in which we might transform the publishing system, particularly for the humanities. She was prompted to write this book based on her own frustrating experiences trying to get her well-received first book published. But I think it embodies a sort of innovative approach to humanities publishing, not only in the kind of arguments that it makes, but in the ways in which this book was reviewed. So Kathleen used an open peer review process. She shared her draft online using a platform called Comment Press, which allows the community to add their own comments on a manuscript at the paragraph or page level. And the author can engage in a kind of ongoing dialogue with the commenters. This sort of brings attention to the social nature of publishing. And Kathleen put out a call for comments and got about 300 from the community from 44 different people by putting this manuscript online. Even before it was published officially in book form by NYU Press, it was featured on syllabi, it was discussed in 20 different publications, and it was even reviewed by a publication. I have a sort of bit role in this book, in that I was asked to be the external reviewer for this publication. And Kathleen made such a compelling case about some of the problems with anonymous reviewing in terms of accountability, in terms of potential biases that are shielded by anonymity, and in terms of the need for reviewers to participate in conversations with authors and presses about the significance of works, that when I was asked, would you be willing to make public your reviews, I couldn't say anything but yes. So as the title of this book suggests, we have an issue with the obsolescence of some of the kind of core practices in academia. So she points to the fact that in the humanities and in the academy more broadly, we face an institutional obsolescence, that we are caught in entrenched systems that no longer serve our needs. It would be impossible for me to boil down this book in just a couple minutes, but some of the strategies she suggests include re-envisioning authorship. So not thinking about authorship as focused on products, the publication, but on the process of engaging the community in a discussion of ideas, which is fundamentally, I think, what scholarship is about, sharing and building knowledge. She suggests that we experiment with emerging forms like blogs and multimodal communications that allow us to include what we're talking about in our scholarship, video, images, audio, in our scholarly publications. She suggests that we need to create a community around this problem of how we preserve born digital works, and community is really core to her argument, and that we need to create new business models as well to approach scholarly publication. And she suggests that universities really need to assume more responsibility for disseminating the knowledge that they are producing. So one kind of cornerstone, I think, of reimagining our scholarly communication system is looking at open access publishing. So there are different approaches to open access publishing, but one is to make available your work under a Creative Commons license, where you say, you can reuse this material as long as you attribute it. You can add additional constraints, like you can't use this for commercial purposes, or you have to share and share alike. This, I think, benefits scholarship and benefits sort of the larger community by expanding access to knowledge, so that colleagues at universities that don't have great research libraries like Rice does can have access to our publications, and indeed the larger community. If we think that the humanities has public value, we need to make sure that the public has access to our research, to our publications. Now, this is not just an altruistic project. I would argue that sharing our scholarship openly also benefits scholars in making our scholarship more visible. There have been studies that have indicated that work that is available through open access licenses is more likely to be cited. There's some discussion about this, but it seems like most of the studies point in this direction. And we can also enable information to be built upon, which again is another kind of cornerstone of scholarship. So for example, one can take educational materials that we've developed and adapt them for their own classes, or use data that we've collected and use it in new ways to discover new knowledge. And I'm pleased that my scholarly association, the Association for Computers and the Humanities, recently responded to a White House call for comment on open access by strongly endorsing open access and also speaking to the need for the humanities community to be included in these discussions. Our colleagues in the sciences are much more in tune with open access. I can speak to my own experiences as an academic blogger to the advantages of sharing your work openly. So in 2007, I started a blog called Digital Scholarship in the Humanities, and used it as a way of sort of sharing the answers that I was beginning to explore to questions about the changes in the humanities. And this blog has led to speaking invitations, it's led to invitations to contribute to collections, and perhaps more importantly, it's led to a sort of sense of belonging in the larger community of digital humanists, so that when I go to a conference, I know people already. I'm connected to them through the blog, I'm connected to them through Twitter. There's evidence that this blog gets a lot of use, is read frequently. So as my sort of New Year's present from WordPress, the blogging platform that I use, I got a sort of message saying, your blog has been viewed 40,000 times over the past year. I have 6 blog posts and 40,000 views. That doesn't mean that everyone read and engaged with the post, but I think it does suggest that I have a much larger audience for my work as a result of sharing it through the blog than I would through standard publications. Of course, this does raise issues about how we direct scholarly attention when we have so much information to deal with. And this is a problem that digital humanities now tackles in bringing attention to the kind of current discussions in the digital humanities community, and also bringing credit to those discussions. So this is a project of the Center for History and New Media that both curates current conversations in the digital humanities through an editor's choice section, but it also aggregates ongoing conversations using the RSS feeds that are produced by blogging software that allow you to kind of subscribe to these blogs, using the ongoing conversations via Twitter to identify what people in the community are talking about. They're also planning to have a quarterly publication that filters out sort of the best of the editor's choice features as a way of bringing attention to exemplary digital scholarship. Again, I want to point to some innovative work in scholarly communications here at Rice, Connections being, I think, one of the prime examples of a platform that allows for teachers and scholars to share educational materials and enable those materials to be adapted for different courses. I would also point to the Rice Digital Scholarship Archive. If you're interested in sharing your own scholarly publications, the Digital Scholarship Archive provides a platform for doing that. You may be concerned about copyright, whether your publisher will allow you to share these materials, and I would encourage you to check out a website called Sherpa Romeo that contains publishers' policies about whether you can archive your own materials through, for example, a university institutional repository like the Rice Digital Scholarship Archive. There are also some great blogs in humanities scholarship at Rice, as well as some student blogs that really allow scholars and students to share their work with a larger audience. There are, of course, challenges to reforming scholarly communications as well in terms of developing appropriate business models, in terms of authoring new forms of scholarly argument, especially those that incorporate multimedia, and thinking about how we want to represent scholarly knowledge using digital tools and using digital media. There are challenges with evaluating and providing credit for digital scholarship that's departments and scholarly associations are still working out. And then there are problems that the community is tackling with preserving born digital scholarship. I want to finally turn to teaching and learning, because here I think the digital humanities and the humanities more broadly are making some important changes and making an important impact on student learning. There has been some concern that we're going to see a decline in humanities majors as a result of the recession. I don't know that the data is there to really substantiate that, although during the recession in the 1980s, we did see a decline in humanities majors. What's more troubling to me is the difficulty that many humanities majors are having finding jobs that make use of their degrees. So according to statistics for the Bureau of Labor Statistics, about 45% of recent college graduates under the age of 25 have jobs that require them to use their college degrees, and another 29% have jobs that don't require them to use their degrees. So I'm not arguing that we should turn the humanities into vocational training. I think that would be counterproductive because there's real value in the training that we provide in the humanities. But I think we can help students develop marketable skills as part of their humanities training. So I was interested in the way that digital humanities is approaching education and collected a small corpus of about 130 syllabi in digital humanities broadly conceived, and found that many of these featured student projects where students were challenged to sort of bring together theory and practice and work in teams to create digital collections or to create videos that explored the subjects that they were studying. They also often featured blogs and other forms of social networking and social engagement as a way of kind of going beyond the walls of the classroom, as well as knitting together a community. One of my favorite examples of the use of social networking to enable student learning is the Looking for Whitman project. So this is a project that begins with the insight that classrooms around the world are studying the works of Whitman, but you wouldn't know it. They're sort of isolated from each other. They're walled off. So this project brought together courses in several areas that were relevant to Whitman's life. In New York at CUNY, at Camden, New Jersey, in Northern Virginia at the University of Mary Washington. And they used the blogging platform WordPress to kind of connect all these different classes. So students kind of shared their learning through the blogs. They had common projects like creating a digital museum of visual and material culture. And this project, I would argue, is networked, but it also values place. So students did research, for example, in archives in New York, exploring where Whitman lived. It is scholarly, but it also looks for Whitman in the world, as students shot videos of themselves reading Whitman in particular places. It's open. It transcends the walls of the classroom. It's digital, but it's also archival. Another example of a student-focused project that has really had a public impact is the Seattle Civil Rights and Labor History Project, where students contributed oral histories and digitized images and documents about the history of civil rights in Seattle. And this was used in public education. It was used in training employees in the city to make them aware of its history of civil rights. And it was actually cited in a Supreme Court on segregation in public schools. So evidence of the impact that these sorts of projects can have. And further evidence of the impact is provided by students themselves. So students at Bryn Mawr, Haverford, and Swarthmore organized the first undergraduate digital humanities conference last year. The next one is going to occur in March. And when you look at the videos that these students produced, both as part of the conference and as part of their own reflections on the digital humanities, you see their enthusiasm for being able to sort of go beyond the boundaries of the classroom and produce public knowledge, to do something that's really relevant right now, to be doing real scholarship. I want to quickly point to an example of a program that I think pushes graduate education forward. This is the Praxis Program at the University of Virginia, which brings together teams of humanities graduate students to work with the digital humanists at the Scholars Lab at Virginia to produce a tool. So this is sort of applied learning where they learn about project management, they learn about budgets, they learn about user design, they learn these technical skills. These are all skills that expand their understanding of the humanities as well as prepare them for jobs as faculty members, as department chairs, within libraries, with information technology groups, and so forth. There's some really innovative work in digital pedagogy at Rice that I would point to, whether that includes making mini documentaries or digital stories, or engaging students in blogs, or in building digital archives. So there's energy, I think, already in this community. Of course, there are challenges here as well in terms of helping students develop these skills within the structure of a regular course schedule that's packed with other things as well, providing the appropriate support to students, and evaluating student work. When we're used to individually authored essays, we need to develop new ways of evaluating this work. Finally, I'd like to suggest a few ways that we might look at fostering a strong future for the humanities at Rice. And kind of building on what I've been talking about for the last 15 minutes or so, I think Rice should be conscious in thinking about how to integrate the digital into the humanities curriculum. And that includes how to find, evaluate, and represent humanistic information, how to train students in digital methods and in both the understanding of digital media and the production of digital media, working on collaborative projects. I think the institution can also sort of nudge the digital humanities forward by providing concrete support for experimentation and collaboration through technical support, through seed funding, even possibly through creating humanities labs, like an Oshman design kitchen for the humanities. And also providing support and recognition. So that would include graduate fellowships and fairly evaluating digital scholarship. Individuals, I think, can also think about how to embrace humanities in the digital age by sharing your work through the Rice Digital Scholarship Archive, by learning about colleagues' work in other disciplines and thinking about how their methods may be useful for your own projects as you kind of look at interdisciplinary work. And of course, to play and experiment. And you don't have to do a massive project. You can start small. And my colleagues at the Digital Media Center, I'm sure would be happy to work with you. So finally, I'd like to sort of toast the next 100 years of the humanities at Rice and suggest that may the humanities be experimental and innovative even as they preserve the past, and be open to collaborating across boundaries, to participate in vibrant communities and to share and converse about knowledge, and to prepare students for the demands of the future. So cheers. Thank you. We'll repeat the question. I would love any questions that you have. Yes,
The limit of intellectual ideas, and the conversation is faster. And over time, people still publish books, but usually they are not the first academic output, but it's an accumulation and population after several years of an academic dialogue. And I think what we are partly seeing here, the reason that people is answered by the humanities is also in some sense, I think, that's the expression of obsolescence of the book model.
Mm-hmm. So the question, if you all didn't hear it, is whether the book itself as an expression of humanities scholarship is the primary expression of humanities scholarship is potentially becoming obsolete. And I mean, I would argue that we need to expand what we accept as being humanities publication, humanities scholarship. So the book, I think, still has some relevance as a long-form scholarly argument, but I think at the same time, we should recognize that shorter form works also have value and explore other means of communicating humanities ideas. So, think about whether we can give credit to blogs as an initial expression of humanistic thinking, whether digital archives, if they're properly evaluated, qualify as scholarship. I would argue that yes, many of these do, but we have to have proper ways of evaluating them. So, I mean, I think the book will kind of continue to evolve and to incorporate, different forms of media, for example. We can think of books as sites for conversation and not just as sort of singular expressions. The monograph doesn't necessarily have to be a monologue. So this is still an area that we're in the early days of exploring. But I think that we'll see a sort of broader ecosystem of humanities scholarship, of what is sort of recognized as being a scholarly work in the humanities. Yes?
Could you comment on what's going on with the Google Books issue, with the digitizing libraries, and also the blackout tomorrow with Wikipedia?
So the Google Books settlement has still not been reached. It was thrown out by the judge. So we're still sort of in this limbo of how we can potentially make use of digitized volumes from Google Books. It's just hard to say where that's going to go at this point. In terms of the blackout by Wikipedia as part of the protests against the Stop Online Piracy Act and PIPA, I mean, I think there are real concerns that these pieces of legislation that are ostensibly intended to prevent privacy will really have an incredibly harmful effect on the internet in, shutting down free expression in prohibiting people from linking to sites that potentially have pirated, copyrighted information. So many in the technology community and indeed in the digital humanities community are kind of speaking out against the potentially harmful effects of this legislation. Yes?
I was able to hear the book's people speak to a large room of humanists and social scientists a couple of years ago, and there was a sort of audacious comment by one of these people who was involved in the Google Book project, and he said, I bet not one of you, and he was speaking to a room full of scholars, not publishers, he said, I bet not one of you would mind if we took your book and put it online and made it available for everybody to see. Because people are still going to, for issues of plagiarism, need to cite you. The people that care are the publishers, because then you've taken them out of the picture. There's people who had some issues with that, but I wonder if you had any thoughts on that, and if you would speak to that, because there does seem to be an issue of copyright, which is not necessarily something that an author is going to care.
Right, yeah. I mean, it's difficult for me to kind of speak for the entire community of authors, but I think, you know, in the scholarly community, what you are aiming for is recognition, and that recognition is more likely to result if your work is accessible. Whereas, of course, the publishing community is trying to sort of clamp down on access, which is manifested, for example, in new legislation, the Research Works Act, which is trying to prevent federal agencies from instituting open access mandates. So, you know, the world of policy around scholarly information is complicated, but I mean, I do think that scholars can see a benefit from making their work as accessible as possible. And I know that I have myself discovered many useful resources through searching Google Books. Now, there are larger issues about whether we want a corporation to own, you know, scholarly information that I think is pushing, for example, the Digital Library of America project, where universities and cultural institutions can take responsibility for building digital libraries and controlling the scholarly information that we make available. And I think it would be better if we, as a scholarly community, could take responsibility for building these new institutions to provide access to scholarship, these new forms of scholarship. So I hope that answers the question. Yeah.
I'm curious if you're worried about maintaining scholarly standards in these new forms of scholarship like crowdsourcing, whatever, we should just relax and trust that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we do need to develop ways of evaluating scholarship in this world where people are publishing their work on blogs and in other, other digital platforms. But I mean, there's this shift towards, post publication peer review, where through platforms like Comment Press, where you invite the community to evaluate the scholarship. So you still have a robust discussion about the value of the scholarship, and you can use different filters and metrics to sort of measure the impact that the scholarship is having on the community. It's not about throwing out the standards. It's about devising new ways of evaluating the scholarship in a sort of digital medium. Yes?
This is a sort of strange question, but what are the standards for Amazon to publish books as Kindle books? In other words, an author goes and says, "Will you publish my book on Amazon?" Do they have any standards at all?
Well, so typically they work with publishers to work out deals for publishing works for the Kindle platform, although they're moving to also working with individual authors as part of that process.
The reason I bring this up is you're an assistant professor at an institution like Rice. You get your book published by Amazon. How does that comparison to somebody who gets their book published on Oxford Press?
No tenure.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, humanities scholarship is still driven by the sort of reputation of the publisher. And in a sense, tenure committees turn to academic publishers to provide that level of peer review, of establishing the value of the scholarship. So you might be taking a risk if you go with, you know, just publishing through Amazon as opposed to publishing through a reputable press, where they can kind of give the stamp of approval to your work. Yes?
Yes. Lisa, thank you for a great talk. You know, what I really appreciate is how you talked both about the opportunities and the challenges.
Mm-hmm.
One of the challenges that I find particularly not is the one about how we translate the opportunities of digitized humanities when it comes to dissemination of knowledge, and then how it impacts our teaching.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd like to just say briefly my sense for scientists and engineers who do lots and lots of collaborative work, but they do something else. They get together all the time and they talk with each other. They have seminars together. And there's a certain money in science and engineering to actually fly and go talk. And people get together and they talk all the time. They teach each other in a way we never do in humanities. And that's something that with shrinking budgets makes it very difficult for us to begin to do, if only in fact it becomes more and more difficult. Secondly, there's a kind of, at the same time, the best knowledge comes from real interaction when people are talking about the text, whether it's online or in a book. They're talking about it together. It just doesn't happen you can't just have a blog going back and forth like this. A blog is better than nothing else. But I sometimes think that when it comes to teaching, we're talking about online courses and the teacher is indispensable. And of course, there are huge ways in which we need to change. But there's a level of exchange that has to do with the quality and the creativity and the originality of knowledge in the humanities that is very much like what happens in the sciences, and that only happens with visceral connection. And I'm worried that there is going to be some difficulty as we move to digitize, as we move to quantitative measurement, that we will begin to value those kinds of knowledge that can be measured, and the kind of nuanced knowledge that is really genuine. If I'm teaching Flannery O'Connor and someone wants to know who she is, they can go online and in 5 minutes have 18 ideas about who she is, and none of them might be the nuanced entry into Flannery O'Connor that they might have in an exchange with faculty members. So do you have any sense for how we can make digitized humanities that take advantage of these challenges, not weaken and limit what we can do?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that's one of the core challenges in terms of how to use the digitized humanities to enhance learning and to bring value to the exchange of ideas, the sort of magic that happens in the classroom. And as someone who personally benefited from my own humanities classes here at Rice, I wouldn't want to give up that human connection and the sort of power of conversation around ideas. I think that the digitized humanities expand what we can bring into the classroom as we begin to discuss these materials. We have access to the archival materials that we wouldn't have dreamed about 20 years ago. I think that we can help students understand how to use these new tools as a way of making sense of humanistic information. In terms of how we build communities to kind of discuss ideas and produce new knowledge, I do think we can use network technologies to make that happen. It may not be the same as face-to-face exchanges, But I know as a member of the digital humanities community, we engage in frequent conversations using Twitter. And people are very connected to in that community. Ideas are frequently exchanged. New ideas are generated. So, I mean, I do think we can make use of these technologies to facilitate these broader conversations. As someone who's working in a telecommuting position now, I actually feel quite connected to my colleagues via Google Video Chat. You know, I notice when they get their hair cut. So I think we can use these sorts of technologies to foster conversation as well. But I agree that there's something kind of fundamental about the face-to-face exchange of information and ideas that's hard to replace.
I had a question about this conversation or about the community that you frequently reference here, and that I could ask the question from a populist point of view or from an academic elitist point of view, and that is sort of like, what is the audience of this conversation? And so from a populist point of view, the Whitman example of 30,000 kids from 143 countries, who were those people? Were they academics? Were they the general public? Was there Whitman getting disseminated in a way that couldn't be done before? Or I could ask you from an academic, some slightly elitist point of view, and say, is that watering down a scholarly conversation by having it have to reach a broader common denominator in terms of, and so the issue of this conversation, which you reference frequently in a sort of singular way, I just wonder, how does that become valuable, or how do we understand the parameters of that conversation?
So in terms of the Whitman example, it's difficult to say based on web hits who's accessing this information, but I can say from speaking to scholars in the community that this is a digital resource that has had real impact on the practice of scholarship. I mean, because Whitman revised his poetry so frequently, the web makes much more sense as a publication medium than a book does. It can allow you to trace this history of revision, for example. But I think that we don't sort of water down the humanities by providing broader access to this information. I think it demonstrates the value of the kind of work that we do. It seems to me, appropriate, especially for Whitman, to embrace this kind of democratic approach to scholarship. In terms of the broader digital humanities community, that is quite diverse. So it includes, faculty in fields like history and philosophy and literary study. It includes graduate students. It includes librarians, information technologists. It includes some people who just have a passion for the humanities and want to share that passion. And again, maybe I'm, a sort of optimistic pragmatist, but I think it's great that we have these larger communities to discuss the humanities.
So let me, at this point, I know some of you will still have questions, and we do have a reception outside, but I want to take the opportunity to thank Lisa for putting together a wonderful talk that introduced us to so many resources. I want to assure you that this talk will be posted on the Scientia website approximately 2 weeks from now, so that if you couldn't write fast enough, as I certainly couldn't, to get all the ones down that I want to consult, you can look at it there. So I want to, please, can we thank Lisa for a wonderful, wonderful talk.
Thank you. And these slides will be posted, by the way, to my blog, probably on Thursday.
All right, so you have multiple ways to access. And let me just say a couple of more things. For those, since the open access movement was so prominently featured here, faculty members, you should know that a draft open access policy is posted on your Faculty Senate website and is available for your comments on our wiki. And we So if you haven't taken a look yet, now is the time. And we want to thank the many people, including Geneva Henry, who helped with that, and Sarah Lohman. And then finally, thank you very much for mentioning the DeLange Conference coming up on February 27th and 28th. If you're intrigued by the ideas that were covered here, Kathy Davidson, as Lisa mentioned, will be here, and she will be talking about interesting things. And we'll have a number of speakers dealing with humanities and the future of liberal education, and basically the future of the research university in a global age. So you can register online now, free for all Rice, members of the Rice community, at delang.rice.edu. And with that, thank you all so much for coming, and please join us at the reception outside. Thanks to all.
Thank you, Susan.
This program is protected by copyright and may not be redistributed in whole or in part without the express written consent of Rice University Digital Media Services.